Hi everybody, welcome to the last lecture of our Agriculture and Rural Land Use unit. This is kind of a wrap-up that addresses some random stuff that doesn't seem to really fit into any of the other chapter sections we've studied. So make sure that you take notes and let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first thing that I want to talk about is primary economic activity versus secondary economic activity. So primary economic activity is concerned with the extraction of raw materials like fishing, farming, and mining. So it makes sense. I mean, it's like the first thing that you have to do to make money is worry about like what from the natural world you can sell, right? Makes total sense. Then there's secondary economic activity, which takes everything a step further. So it involves processing raw materials from your primary economic activity. So for example, turning timber into furniture, turning iron ore into steel. Any factory can be seen as a system that involves secondary economic activity being made from primary economic activity, right? Like that's what a factory does. They take cotton, which was picked, and they turn it into thread, and then they turn it into clothes. So they take the product of primary and turn it into secondary. But one thing that I want to kind of call to your attention when it comes to agriculture and rural land use is modern farmers. So modern farmers are much different from farmers of the past. Unlike farmers of the past who just grew their products and took them to market to sell and then someone would make them into something, there are a couple things that are changing. The first thing is that, as I'm sure you've heard just in the news and by being alive, we have more labor, well, not necessarily labor intensive. I'm having trouble talking today. Our food is produced more, it has more done to it than food of the past. So instead of just picking food, right, we genetically engineer our food or we process it. And so that really turns modern farming into more than just a primary economic activity. It's becoming more of a secondary economic activity. Modern farmers also research what people in their area want. They market and they manufacture their products. They're much more likely to be involved in both primary and secondary economic activity than they are just primary. Next, I want to talk about shifting cultivation. We've talked about shifting cultivation before, which is basically the idea that you rotate your crops. So you use this land, then you abandon it to use other land. One of the aspects of shifting cultivation is multi-cropping, which is the practice of growing two or more crops in the same piece of land, but in different growing seasons. And it's a way to use shifting cultivation, but not waste as much time. So it's technically considered an aspect or a method of shifting cultivation. And I wanted to make sure you knew that. All right, so we haven't talked a lot about this, but when you think about the United States and you think about farming, I tend to think about old Westerns. I don't know if you've seen them. Or Little House on the Prairie. Basically any movies or pictures that involve like being out in the middle of nowhere and having like some tiny town that like kind of pops out of the ground, right? I also think about isolated farmsteads, which is more like Little House on the Prairie. So why did these evolve in the United States and not as much in every other country in the world? Europe has some of these, but the United States just has a lot of isolated farmsteads that developed in the early 20th century. First of all, political stability. A lot of these developed after the Civil War, and for a long time, like until World War I, we really didn't go to war. But even during World War I and World War II, it wasn't a land on our home turf. So people felt politically stable enough to be able to buy land and not have it taken away by the government. And in a lot of other countries that might happen. Somebody might come in and take your land, but in the U.S. that really hasn't been a concern over the past 100 years. Next is colonization by individual pioneer families. Even in the early 1800s, families were taking, if you've played the game Oregon Trail, they were taking the Oregon Trail out to the west. And they were kind of setting up their own little colonies, their own little towns, their own little farmsteads. Then agricultural private enterprise. The United States, because we have a governmental system, and we definitely had a governmental system before these huge farms that we now have. Our economy was set up so that people could, without government interference for the most part, like 100 years ago, they could just set up their land, they could grow stuff. If they had more than they needed for their family, they could sell it. And then governmental land policy. So the government was kind of selling land out west pretty cheaply in the last 100, 150, 200 years because they wanted people to settle the West. And so the policy about land and how easy it was to get land and how cheap land was made it really, really appealing to people who would want a farm. The next thing you need to know, and we've talked about this in class, but I feel like some people are going to forget it, the leading export crop in the whole world is wheat, and that's in terms of metric tons. So keep that in your head. All right, we've mentioned Mediterranean agriculture before, but I want to go into a little more depth on it. So the first thing is, where is Mediterranean agriculture? Mediterranean agriculture is located in the Mediterranean basin. So that's France, Spain, Italy, Algeria, Morocco, Turkey, Tunisia, Israel, Northern Nile Valley, basically all the regions surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And we'll look at a map of that in just a second. It's also located in California and central Chile and the southern part of South Africa. And finally, it's located in Lower Murray, which is a basin in South Australia. So what are some characteristics of Mediterranean agriculture? Well, first, the natural setting lends itself to Mediterranean agriculture because it has kind of unpredictable rainfall, mild temperatures, irregular topography, kind of like hilly a little bit. And it's close to a large body of water so that even though there's like large rainfall, they can get water to the crops. In this type, farming is intensive, meaning a lot of effort has to be put into it. It's specialized, meaning there's like really specific things that are grown, but it's also varied. So they specialize in growing certain types of crops very well, but they are able to grow a lot of different crops. So many crops like wheat, and subsistence agriculture occurs side by side with commercial farming in a lot of parts of the world that do Mediterranean agriculture. Many crops like wheat, barley, and vegetables are raised for domestic consumption in this area, and others like citrus fruits, olives, and grapes are mainly grown for export. The Mediterranean lands are also known as orchard lands of the world because a lot of things that would be grown in orchards are grown in Mediterranean areas. The land use in these areas is dependent on such factors as the total amount of annual rainfall, right? Like California's been in a drought lately, so it's a lot harder for them to grow the grapes that they need in California wine country. The length of the summer drought, the availability of melting snow, local soil conditions, and price fluctuations in local and the world market. So here's a map of Mediterranean agriculture. As you see, southern Australia. This right here is the Mediterranean Sea, so that whole area is Mediterranean. Southern tip of South Africa, Chile, and California. Okay, the next thing is that I want to make sure that everyone knows where the Fertile Crescent is / was. So number 6 says turkey and wheat, and you're probably like, is that a sandwich? No. So what I'm trying to point out to you is that many people believe, based on historical records and looking through ruins of old communities, that wheat was first domesticated in the country of Turkey. And you're probably thinking, okay, like, what is that? How could I have inferred that when I was taking the AP test? Well, let me show you. Okay, so if you are looking at this map of the ancient location of the Fertile Crescent, you can see that it's here where the green is. All of this stuff in brown and all of these lines are modern countries. So this is Turkey, and the southern part of Turkey goes down here to the top of the Fertile Crescent. So if you were asked, like, where was wheat probably first domesticated? Well, we know from agricultural records that it was probably first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. And even though the Fertile Crescent, a lot of it is not fertile anymore because of over-farming and lack of rainfall, we also know that it used to be fertile, and it used to be the place where a lot of modern agriculture was started. So when you think about that, when you think about where did wheat begin, most geographers will tell you that it's somewhere right in here, which is the southern part of Turkey. And I just want you to be aware, these are the countries that all kind of converge in the Southern Crescent, the modern day countries. So Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran for the most part. There are a couple other smaller countries involved, but those are the main larger ones. All right, another thing that I want to talk to you about is why grain production has increased since 1950. And you might say, oh, that's probably due to the climate. And the climate might have something to do with it, but ultimately an increase in the use of energy, so like fossil fuels and stuff, and technology has helped us increase grain production. So think about between 1950 and now, we've had more like larger tillers and huge pieces of farm equipment invented and perfected almost. We've had more GMOs being produced. We've had more mechanization in the way that we farm. And so that has allowed us to increase production, produce more grain, and now the U.S. is starting to ship that all over the world. The 8th thing that I want you to know is that India has a great climate for the production of rice. India has lots and lots of rainfall, and there are mountains, and so they can kind of practice some ridge farming where they trap some of the water, but then also release it from the rice fields. So I just want to let you know, India and rice. Keep that in your mind. India produces a lot of rice. So let's talk about where a lot of U.S. fruits and vegetables come from. I want you to think about the fact that in most of the United States, it gets super duper cold during the winter. I know living in Florida, you don't think about that. It kind of blows your mind, but it's true. So during the winter, most of the U.S. cannot grow fresh fruits and vegetables. So I want you to think through this logically with me. Where in the regions surrounding the United States, like pretty close to the United States, could we get fruits and vegetables for a longer period of time and still not have to pay to get them from all over the world? This line shows that a lot of the ocean has been cut out to make the map smaller. Keep that in mind. So the closest place to the U.S., if this were a big, big ocean here, would be central Chile. So during the winter, a lot of the vegetables and fruits that you see in grocery stores are actually going to be from Chile, which is really interesting. All right, let's talk about extensive land use. So extensive land use basically means that you have a small input of labor, fertilizers, and capital in comparison to the land area that is being farmed. So in the U.S., we have a lot of technology. So relative to the amount of land that we're farming, like this, the acres, we are not using that much manpower. So think about, like, this is an example, this is not an exact figure, but for every 100 acres, maybe we have 10 people working on a farm. But in other countries that don't have all of that technology, that have not bought seeds for drought-resistant crops, that don't have huge machines to harvest their crops for them, they might be using 10 people per square acre of land, right? So that's a lot more people, I'm sorry, this is going all over the place, per section of land area. All right, I'm going to point out something too, again, that to me seems like common sense, but again, common sense is not always so common. So the largest percent of the world's total land area is used in 2 agricultural areas, and it's shifting cultivation and nomadic herding. Shifting cultivation makes sense, right? Like, if you use old-fashioned shifting cultivation where you're not rotating your crops, you're not doing multi-cropping, then there's a lot of land area that's just sitting there empty. Even if you're multi-cropping, that's still a lot of land because you have to find another use, and you have to have twice as much land than if you were just going to keep growing the same crop over and over and over again. Nomadic herding makes sense. If you want your animals to be able to eat off the land and you want to move them around, you're going to take up a lot of land because it takes way more land to say, okay, animals, go find your own food on this section of land, and then they eat all of it, and then you have to move again, than it does to just like put them in a pen and be like, here's your food, animals. Just so you know, labor-intensive intertillage, like growing between the rows is really, really common in Southeast Asia. All right, now I want to talk about Carl Sauer. Carl Sauer had a theory about plant domestication that was actually like newer. Believe it or not, in 1952, he was like the new kid on the block. So in 1952, he published, and published should not be italicized, Agricultural Origins and Dispersals. Before Sauer, the idea that the first plants were domesticated in Southeast Asia. After Sauer, he said there were multiple hearths of plant domestication, as we've read in our textbook, but that the first was in Southeast Asia. So he's not all about the Fertile Crescent being the first place. According to Sauer, seed agriculture or grains came first. Sorry, according to pre-Sauer, but according to Sauer, vegetable planting like root crops like potatoes and all of that came first. Before Sauer, a lot of thinkers argued that harsh climates forced innovation due to population pressure and hunger. But Carl said that our first plants were domesticated and farmed in areas of high biodiversity. So there were many habitats and many different plant species, and this allowed hunter-gatherers to become sedentary, which naturally led to experimentation with root crops like potatoes, ginger, garlic. I'm trying to think of more root crops. If you can think of more, let me know. Beans. According to the pre-Sauer thinkers, rapid innovation occurred. We just figured out farming like super fast. According to Sauer, gradually we figured this out. Pre-Sauer, they thought that plant domestication had happened only 10,000 years ago, but Sauer believes that this happened over 14,000 years ago. All right, this was a super duper random thing, and I know you're like, okay, but like, why are we looking at this? It's because I've seen a question on it. And let's talk about the difference between North American ranchers and ranchers from Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil. So I want you to know that even though you think America and you think beef, right? Ranchers from Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil are way more likely to export their beef than American ranchers. They just lead in beef exportation. So let's take a look at a really quick article that I want you to just be aware of. Okay, as you can see, according to Beef Research Council, South America is the world leader in beef exports, and it's led by Brazil. It has rapidly emerged as the global leader in beef exports, surpassing the $1 billion mark in 2001. Within 2 years, Brazil moved ahead of Canada to be the third largest beef exporter, trailing only the United States and Australia. By 2007, Brazil had surpassed Australia as the largest beef exporter, and as U.S. exports have been hindered by bovine spongiform, Brazil's exports have been shaped by foot and mouth disease, but nowadays, by the way, they have surpassed us. So in beef exports, they actually surpassed the United States, even though the United States used to be like right ahead of them. They've now gone ahead of us in South America. Okay. So number of farms and farm size in the United States. I've said this a lot, but I want to re-emphasize it. We have fewer farms in the United States than we have had in the past, but they're getting bigger. Okay, so fewer farms, bigger farms. I want you to think about like the image of the farmer on an enormous combine, and that will kind of tell you, hey, this is why farming looks different. Let me give you the image so that you can have it in your brain. Okay, so in places where subsistence farming happens, you see like people are close to each other because it's so labor intensive that you may not be able to get as much done. So the farm itself is going to be smaller because there aren't huge machines, like people are gathering things by hands. So this is the way it was earlier in the United States and the way it typically is in the developing world. Let me now give you an image of what it would look like in the United States on a really modern mechanized farm. Okay, so this is a completely different image from the one that I last showed you. You can see literally one person can run this entire huge piece of machinery and get so much more land tilled or planted or fertilized or whatever than you can with like people just standing in a field, right? So you want more land because you can get more done, but you don't need as many farms. So these huge corporations kind of grew out of small farms, and they started buying up all the smaller farms, putting them together, and they have one big farm that they run with machines. So that's why there are fewer farms, because if you watch any old movies, I know this stuff just from the fact that I've watched way too many movies. growing up, I watched all these movies about like early 20th century US where people were starting to buy up the little man's farm. That's actually, I think, part of the quote unquote threat in, what is it? In The Wizard of Oz. They think that someone's going to buy the family farm and everyone's freaking out. So let's talk about genetic engineering really quickly. The primary reason that we have genetic engineering is, number one, because we want to protect our plants against drought. I'm not saying that I am like pro-GMO, but that's why GMOs were developed. Drought and pests. Those are the two biggest things that keep people from being able to grow good crops. Not enough rain, too many bugs, or too many like random diseases that the plants can get. So that's why GMOs were invented. The science community is trying to come up with a bunch of different alternatives for genetic modification to make sure that we don't run out of food worldwide. But that's why GMOs, like I said, were invented. Next, I reminded people of this in class and they looked at me blankly, so I'm going to bring it to your attention once again. The Township and Range Land Survey System is something that we talked about in our first unit. Remember how I talked about how 200 years ago the West wasn't very settled, and the United States government looked and said, oh, now we own the West, or we own most of the West, and they were pushing west to get more land. And they wanted to kind of split it up so that as people settled, they could say, this is this town, this is that town. Well, they looked out west and they split everything up into like 1 mile little grids. And you could settle a little 1 mile grid, that would be your town, and if it got too big, it could join with another town to make up like a larger city. That was established by the Land Ordinance of 1785, so just be aware of that. And finally, the most common place in the world to practice subsistence agriculture is the Amazon basin, which makes total sense because there's a lot of water there, a lot of vegetation, and so it's easier to grow stuff. However, deforestation and over-farming has been a problem lately in the Amazon basin. All right, I will see you soon, and have a good night. Bye.